Welcome to our third session of the CCMW's Women's Scholar Series. For the past 39 years, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, or CCMW, has been on an important mission to affirm Canadian Muslim women's identities and to promote an understanding of our lived experiences through community engagement, through research, through influencing public policy, and through striving for positive change. One of CCMW's strategic goals is to promote critical thinking among Muslims and non-Muslims, to challenge stereotypes and assumptions about Islam, Muslim women, and their families. This webinar is part of a series of public seminars focusing on the work of contemporary Muslim women scholars that are based on different topics related to Muslim women. We're looking forward to presenting these seminars over the next 6 months, inshallah. I'll now pass the baton on to Nushat Jaffrey, CCMW's Executive Director. Thanks, Nushat.
Thank you, Nina. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker for this evening. I'd like you to meet Dr. Mariam Khan. She's PhD and MSW. She's an assistant professor at Wilfrid Laurier University's Faculty of Social Work. She has over 10 years of clinical experience in mental health and addictions, working with children, queer youth, and adults in various interdisciplinary nonprofit settings. As a qualitative and mixed methods researcher, Mariam is passionate about producing critical knowledges and working with racialized LGBTQ individuals and communities, religious and spiritual sexual minorities, Islam and Muslim women, LGBTQ policy and education, gender variance and disability or ability, social construction and representation of race and otherness, sex workers, HIV, AIDS, and intersectional identities of ethnic minorities. Theoretically, Mariam draws on critical pedagogies such as intersectionality and standpoint feminisms, indigenous knowledges and decolonization perspectives, transnational and critical race feminisms, liberatory Islamic perspectives, Islamic perspectives, anti-colonial and post-colonial approaches to social work practice, education, and research. Over to you, Mariam, and welcome to CCMW.
Thank you so much, Nushat. Thank you so much, Nina, for having me here today. Greetings. I begin by acknowledging that the land I'm situated on in the Waterloo region is on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral people. And I am just going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint. Okay, let me see. Just bear with me, folks. Okay, I hope everyone can see the screen.
Yep, I can see it.
Excellent. So my name is Mariam, and welcome to my talk on talking back from the margins, Islam in the lives of sexually and gender diverse Muslim women. And this presentation is based on my doctoral research study, and I'm really happy to be here, and I look forward to having conversations with you. So on the agenda today, I'll start by discussing the need for this work and its importance to me and to the queer Muslim community. Then I'll move on to the research topic and spend some time on the research questions. I will then briefly discuss the theoretical approaches and why these were selected for the study. And after that, I will discuss the methodology and data analysis, followed by some key findings and study limitations. After all of these sections, I will spend some time discussing the study's contribution to knowledge on LGBTQ Muslim women. And then lastly, I'm hoping we can spend some time on comments and questions at the end of the presentation. This topic is important to me as a queer Muslim, and publicly identifying as a queer Muslim comes with its unique challenges. I believe that Islam is inclusive it is for everyone. And from an Islamic standpoint, oppression is against the divine will. And as a Muslim citizen of this world, I find it my responsibility to work towards social justice and fight oppression in all its forms. The participants I interviewed are helping to create awareness of a lesbian, bisexual, trans, and queer LGBTQ Muslim women intersectionality in both normative Muslim and the larger LGBTQ communities. By normative, I'm referring to the specific ways of being and living that are constructed as acceptable and normal in mainstream society, as dictated by cultural expectations, gender roles, and so forth. And there are certain hegemonic or pervasive norms within the larger society that are oppressive and get in the way of LGBTQ Muslim women living out a dignified and respectful existence. In the larger body of scholarship on LGBTQ Muslims, there are many hegemonic or pervasive discourses connected to the norms and I will touch upon a few here. One pervasive dominant norm is that one cannot be LGBTQ and Muslim at the same time. And this manifests as LGBTQ Muslim women identities are considered as unnatural and an anomaly. There's another discourse which really centralizes the marginality associated with being LGBTQ Muslim women and how hard it is to be that positionality. And this has been evidenced in a lot of contemporary research. There's another discourse which says that LGBTQ Muslim women are seen as non-agentic and Islam as causing their oppression, particularly at the intersection of sexuality and religiosity, where LGBTQ Muslim women are on the one hand often exoticized and on the other hand are not held to be authentic Muslims. Another contemporary discourse, hegemonic discourse, is that the nation states in the global north, and by that I mean US, Canada, and the UK, are imagined as secular and progressive when it comes to honoring sexual and gender diversity. And because of that, normative LGBTQ spaces are seen as mainly secular and are seen as welcoming spaces to all LGBTQs. And there is very limited or no recognition of Islamophobia in these LGBTQ spaces. Another popular discourse, hegemonic discourse, is that Islam and Muslims are imagined as not being able to be a part of the progressive ideologies of the nation states in the global north, because Islam is constructed as inherently transphobic, biphobic, and homophobic. And by virtue of that, diasporic Muslim families are also constructed in this way. They're constructed as subjects that are unable to break away the cultural and religious chains and are caught in between oppressive Islamic and ethnic cultures. Another common discourse in the literature is that one has to either abandon Islam and their Muslim identity if you are to also become subjects that can be absorbed into the fold of the nation states in the global north. And you either have to be queer or Muslim. That's another common discourse. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my doctoral study. My doctoral study was a qualitative research study which critically examined the life stories of 14 LGBTQ Muslim women across North America, Canada, and the US. And the first question that you see there, it really explored the ways in which the intersections of race, sexuality, gender identity and expression, religion, and spirituality were lived out amongst the hegemonic discourses that I just talked about with you, which are existing in both normative Muslim and LGBTQ communities. The second and third questions speak to what are some of the strategies and politics that are deployed by LGBTQ Muslim women to resist, subvert, and challenge pervasive homo and hetero norms. And lastly, what does it mean to be a LGBTQ Muslim woman? As I had mentioned earlier, Muslim women are often imagined in the global north as non-agentic and as Islam causing their oppression. The questions that I shared with you today, they emerged through examining gaps in the scholarly literature. The existing scholarly literature on the experiences of LGBTQ Muslim women does not specifically focus on resistance and agency of LGBTQ Muslim women within an Islamic context. LGBTQ Muslim women are mainly situated in the literature as passive victims of patriarchy and not as knowledge holders on Islam. Even within dominant Islamic discourse, they render LGBTQ Muslim women invisible. And whenever there is any kind of recognition that is available, it is evidenced in deviance, debauchery, and abnormality. Overall, there's been a lack of affirmative scholarship on LGBTQ Muslim women's experiences and a limited exploration of some of the hegemonic norms and discourses that are found in mainstream LGBTQ communities, especially in Canada and the US, with a strong focus on race. I'm going to move on to my theoretical approaches. There was no single approach that covered the breadth of topic I examined, so I selected 4 overarching approaches to guide the study in a comprehensive fashion, like critical race feminism, transnational feminism, an intersectional approach, and the Islamic liberation theological framing. And a few things that I wanted to emphasize are that these approaches are really not self-contained or mutually exclusive. And I'm drawing attention to significant aspects of these approaches to help me answer the research questions I just shared with you. And I entered these approaches through particular theorists and scholars, and some of which are listed here that really influenced my thinking. So just really briefly, critical race feminism, it examines and foregrounds issues related to race, gender, and citizenship, and about how all of these are enmeshed when ongoing systems of coloniality and imperialism. And this was really important to the research project because the discursive and material production of racialized identities and identity categories, such as Muslim women, gender, and Islam, they really do need to be scrutinized. Transnational feminism was used because it really draws attention and dismantles against this homogenous racialized women configuration that we see in contemporary media and literature. Transnational feminism makes links between local and global contexts when tracing moving subjects like diasporic LGBTQ Muslims across visibly regulated borders like nation states and invisible borders like the shifting terrain of sociopolitical constructions of identity and identity politics. And I can say a lot more about that, but I'm going to hold off. And so transnational feminism really helped the study help me locate new ways of mapping out some of these constructed identity categories across local and geopolitical contexts, which was specific to the participants. For example, how the participants took up coming out to family and friends within their ethnocultural communities of origin, whether it's back home and also within the diaspora communities in Canada and the US. I also used intersectional approach, which was really helpful in theorizing LGBTQ Muslim subjectivities, because it really helps understand how identities shift, they melt, and they fuse together with objects and bodies. And identities are fluid and are socially constructed, and it helps keep track of the shifting complexities of these things. Lastly, I focused on liberatory perspectives on the Islamic tradition and its texts, because this approach really seeks to liberate the Quran and other Islamic texts from patriarchy, compulsory heterosexuality, and sexism, among other isms. And it really considers social justice and emancipation for all peoples, irrespective of ethnicity and religion. Very close to what you heard in the beginning when there was a land acknowledgement that was done, I believe by Zainab. So in the dissertation, I drew on scholars who operate within a feminist-oriented gender, sexuality, and race-sensitive readings and understandings of the Islamic tradition. Now I'm going to move on to methodology. So I ended up using an interpretive qualitative method. This was really important because lived experiences are considered sources of knowledge. And also knowledges are considered as being socially constructed. And this was really important in exploring how LGBTQ Muslim women are navigating some of these hegemonic norms in their many communities of belonging. In a life story methodology, the participants actually have the power over what is shared and how it gets shared. And the narrative is a source of knowledge and the meanings that are attached to various aspects of living out life as a LGBTQ Muslim woman. So it really places the emphasis on meanings that people make. I ended up using two main recruitment strategies and snowballing as a technique. The first strategy was in-person recruitment at many LGBTQ Muslim support group community events, and also mainstream LGBTQ places of worship like the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto and some of the agencies like the 519 Church Street Community Center in downtown Toronto. And the second method was online. I targeted support groups online that mainly serve LGBTQ Muslims and their allies on social networks like Facebook, Google, Hotmail. So in total, I recruited 14 participants, and which ranged in the ages of 23 to 38, and 12 were recruited from Canada and 2 from the US. Majority of the participants identified as racialized, and 2 participants identified as white of European descent. And the participants really varied in sect identification and their approaches to Islam and its practice. So I had people who identified as Shia, Ismaili, Sunni, Sufi, to name a few. Sorry, just gonna drink some water. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about is the data analysis. So I was trying to find something that really looked at the nuances that are embedded in the layers of complexities that exist in a narrative. And so I found this really cool Zoom model that was developed by Pamphilian. And what it does, it examines life stories on nuanced and layered levels. And much in the same way, the zoom function works on your camera. And it allows you to concentrate on a specific area of a narrative and then to expand it and then zoom in and out. And so there are a few levels in the zoom model. And at the macro level, this layer looks at the sociocultural collective dimensions of the life history, of the life story. A personal narrative can reveal about the culturally specific processes that impact on all of the participants and what were some of the dominant discourses and the types that the narrative form takes. Who does it centralize and how some of the historical events shape and impact the narrative. When I was doing the interviews, it was very close to the 2016 Orlando Pulse shooting. And just as an example, the aftermath that happened, with Muslims in the States as well as queer Muslims here in Canada was felt very strongly by the participants that I interviewed. Moving on to the second Zoom level, which is called a meso level. And here, attention is paid on the style, the themes, and key phrases that are found in the narrative. And this really allowed for analysis on what areas of the narrative interaction between myself and the participant flowed easily, and the parts that the participants had difficulty sharing. And then the micro level, it really looks at some of the pauses, the silences, and emotions that are with the narrative. And these are seen as important sources of data. The last Zoom level is called Interactional Level, and I have called it critical reflexivity because in many ways it does operate as such. So what it does on this level, it zooms in on the interactions, the power dynamics between myself as researcher and the participants, and it speaks to how positionality is implicated. My positionality is implicated in knowledge production, and that knowledge is co-constructed and co-created. And here I spoke to some of the, complexing things about being an insider, outsider, working with communities that you are a part of and researching with communities that you are a part of. So I talked about that. And so what I really appreciate about this model is that it really doesn't emphasize some areas of life story over others. And it really does celebrate the contradictions that exist in life story narratives, because all of our lives are complex and they're not static. And this model really considers the interpretive nature of life stories as created jointly by the researcher and the interviewee. And as I had mentioned before, the researcher is involved in producing the knowledges, and it allows the narratives to be analyzed using the selected theoretical approaches that I just shared with you a little bit earlier. So now I would like to move on to some of the key findings that I would like to highlight for you. And I will discuss some overarching interrelated themes and sub-themes. And then I will also try to make some connections to the literature. So the first one I want to talk about is called Identity as a Whole. And so this larger theme examined how participants understood their intersectional identities in various domains like their ethno-racial community, their family, their professional circles, and so forth. And by intersectional identity, I'm talking about the positionality facets like race, gender identity and expression, ability, spirituality, class, those kinds of things. And so in this key finding, the positionality facets like gender identity and expression, religion, sexuality, ethnicity were seen together, were not separated in silos within the narratives. And this separation of identity has been documented in the literature. If you were to take up some look, if you were to look at some studies that were done on being queer and Muslim. And so in my study, the positionality facets were seen as intricately enmeshed and were considered inseparable. Participants discussed identities as one organic entity, which was fluid and shifted according to the context at hand. And so to illustrate, I would like to share a participant Selma had mentioned. She discusses her Muslim identity as cultural, which is enmeshed with her familial, racial, and community facets. And she did not separate different facets, aspects of her. And I quote, "In terms of my family identity, my racial identity has been very important to me. I guess I'm a pick and chooser in terms of actual religious practice. I will fast some Ramadans and I don't usually pray. I'll say Bismillah before I do something. It is a cultural identity and the way I form community with other people. Doing communal prayers or fasting with my family, that is a tradition what ends up being spiritual. For me, Islam is a communal practice, and it is impossible to separate the doctrine and spirituality from the cultural and the social, since they are one of the same. They are part of the same package." The next finding I would like to highlight and the larger theme of varying relationships. So this larger theme examined the ways in which participants had varying relationships and lived their intersectional identities in their many communities of belonging, and how they managed the relationships and conflicts. And so I want to talk about two types of relationships. The first one with normative Muslim communities, and the second one I will talk about is within normative LGBTQ plus communities. So within this big theme of varying relationships, I found that the participants engaged in building and fostering relationships and consistently negotiated these relationships while traversing through life's milestones. So that could be the process of coming out, for some getting married, for some having kids, for some getting their own place and becoming independent. And within normative Muslim communities, the participants experienced a range of positive and negative and in between experiences related to coming out to family and friends. Many participants remarked that the level of religiosity of family members, relatives, and friends could not be used as a marker to determine acceptance of sexual and gender diversity. For example, in the case of some participants, acceptance of sexual and gender diversity, it came from unexpected sources, like religious leaders, and in some cases, a conservative and a religious parent. Hajra, who was an Arab Egyptian queer woman and whose father she identified as more religious and conservative, actually accepted and celebrated her marriage to another woman, whereas her mother, who Hajra described as being culturally Muslim, did not accept her same-sex marriage. Some participants did experience strong rejection from their families in the form of being kicked out and initially disowned by parents and family members. But in all cases, the relationships and ties with community, family, and friends were never final, as these were negotiated on an ongoing basis and connections were maintained in many ways by both parties through visits, dinner invitations, coffee dates, phone calls, and so on. And the findings also suggest that diasporic racialized Muslim communities and families in North America are diverse, and as a result have diverse and varying responses to queerness and to LGBTQ Muslims. Relationships with family and community continue to evolve, and that family acceptance can be viewed on a continuum. Some contemporary research on families of origin and choice of LGBTQ Muslims is very limited because the research that is out there sometimes constructs Muslim families in very static ways as inherently trans, biphobic, and homophobic, and LGBTQ Muslims as rejecting their families outright and cutting ties. And there's a growing body of scholarship which really touches upon some of the nuances and dynamics of families from a critical lens that really challenge some of the Orientalist or static constructions of diasporic Muslim families. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the second relationship with normative LGBTQ communities. Almost all of the participants shared mainly negative experiences within the larger LGBTQ communities. Especially the 12 racialized participants experienced othering in the form of Islamophobia, racism, and this really dominated the participant stories. The white participants had an easier time navigating the larger LGBTQ spaces because of race, but were marginalized due to their connection with Islam and due to gender. In the narratives, the participants really critiqued some of the normative coming out models in the LGBTQ community because these can propel certain ways of performing and living a LGBTQ life and identity. For example, many participants really critiqued the normative assumption of an assumed correlation between identity acceptance and being out to every known person. And there's definitely a growing body of literature on othering that is experienced by racially, sexually, and gender diverse individuals in mainstream LGBTQ spaces, and which has led to the formation of many LGBTQ Muslim support groups in Canada and the US. The last theme I'm going to talk about is how LGBTQ Muslim women really talked about their agency and their resistance. The first resistance strategy I would like to discuss is titled Existing and Living. By that, I'm referring to many participants stating that by virtue of existence and embodiment of living and identifying as an LGBTQ Muslim woman was considered a form of resistance against the status quo in and of itself. And many participants did not go out to resist and challenge the normative practices and understandings. They were just living their life. And because of living and existing, they were validating LGBTQ Muslim life. The assumption that a LGBTQ Muslim identity being inherently odds with the Muslim identity and Islam were really challenged fiercely in the narratives. There was not one participant who believed that the Quran and other Islamic texts were inherently transphobic and homophobic. In other words, all of the participants noted that they were content with their intersectional identities. Here, as an example, Rani used questioning opportunities to educate individuals and entertain questions about being LGBTQ Muslim women. And Rani's excerpt really demonstrates an affirmative embodiment of an LGBTQ identity, which serves as an example of validation while demonstrating her practice of Islam. So I'll just pause so you can have an opportunity to read that. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to the second subtheme, a form of resistance which was seen in the narratives was in fostering a personal relationship with the Creator and maintaining pluralistic understandings of the Islamic tradition. The participants drew on Islamic principles for spiritual and religious practices, as these were not considered as causing the participants oppression and were actually sources of joy, peace, and what fueled social activism. For example, Fatima, an Iranian trans woman, her narrative excerpt demonstrates a rejection of monolithic and institutional understandings of Islam. And Fatima says, and I quote, "I kept my own version of Islam. It's very much different from what the establishment is promoting and the mainstream Islam is promoting. And the entire concept of Islam is based on unity. And that's why I identify as a Muslim." Fatima's conceptualization of unity, which informs her worldview, ethics, behaviors, and practice of Islam, is very important because, as some of you may already know, unity or tawheed is an important Quranic concept in the Islamic tradition because it commonly speaks to the Creator's oneness and harmony with everyone and everything, which is known and unknown in the universe. Now I'm going to move on to the third subtheme. The participants discussed their resistance and agency as grounded within the Islamic principles of tafsir, ijtihad, and jihad. For example, Sophia used tafsir in this example, and which is engaging in ongoing interpretation of the Quran as a strategy to reconcile any normative incongruences with a LGBTQ Muslim intersectionality. And I quote, "From what I have read in the Quran, everyone can interpret the Quran. I feel that it is good to understand different ways of interpreting. At one point in my life, I can read the Quran and understand it one way. I can always go back and read the same thing and understand it differently after certain life experiences. I feel that the Quran is applicable to your life and at all points in it, so you can find different interpretations of it throughout your lifetime, which is nice. Doing my own research was really important to me." End quote. And I would like to now share an example from Fatima again about ijtihad. And Fatima here discusses through ijtihad, she was able to live out a meaningful and dignified existence. And I'll just take a pause here for folks to read it. Oh, maybe I should read it because there's people on the phone, maybe. Okay. And I quote, maybe what I'm doing is ijtihad, living the life and being honest with yourself and life and with life itself, and searching for the concept of reality and for truth. Searching for reality and for truth in every moment of your life can be ijtihad. Looking at every moment of life to find truth is ijtihad itself. It may not be acceptable scientifically, but what is science? For thousands of years, there was no publications, no movies, scientific circles, or scientific centers as we know it from our own traditional point of view. People lived by their own intuitions and lived based on their own experiences. And this quote, I'm talking, Hawa is talking about jihad, and she's talking about her internal struggles and external struggles. And all of these realms can be aligned together. And I quote, in Sufism, you can't have external jihad unless you have internal jihad. So you have to find a way to resist internal struggles first, then to resist external things that we are trying to fight against. The concept of resistance is super important for anyone who wants to do any work in the realm of being good and doing good. Like you can't do that kind of work unless you find a balance within yourself. End quote. So now I would like to move on to some of the study limitations. And of course, with any kind of qualitative research, qualitative interpretive research, it's very much couched in its own sociopolitical contexts and is socially constructed. So the findings cannot be easily generalized. And of course, these findings do not speak to everyone who identifies as LGBTQ Muslim women. And these findings don't claim to represent anyone who identifies under that label, as because there are very differences and unique differences in how each person and their family lives out their life. And of course, with the small sample size, and I had a mix of specific, and I didn't have a mix of specific identities. So this was a sample of lesbian, bisexual, queer, and trans. And so I think future research could focus in on the lesbian population, the bisexual Muslim population, and so on. And unfortunately, I didn't have any asexual and intersex Muslims in the study. And the recruitment materials, they targeted participants who were okay with identifying as queer and Muslim, as opposed to queer or Muslim. And so the participants were adults, and most of them were out to their families, friends and communities of origin and choice. And most of the participants were involved in advocacy and social justice work internally and externally to the LGBTQ Muslim communities. And they were all involved in LGBTQ Muslim support groups. And so their understandings of Islam, sexuality, and gender diversity would be more affirmative than LGBTQ Muslims who may be socially isolated and economically marginalized, like newcomers, refugees, and so forth. And so even participants who may differ in socioeconomic status and age may have differing experiences. For example, a Muslim LGBTQ youth who may be in a different stage of self-acceptance and reconciliation. So I would like to now share some of the interdisciplinary contributions. And so the study really challenged some of the ongoing Orientalist and monolithic representations of Islam and diasporic Muslims here in Canada and the US. And it really highlighted that there is a continuum of acceptance and support that LGBTQ Muslims receive from their families of origin. And the study also was attempting to bridge a gap that exists between great divides, actually, I should say, that exists between religious, diasporic, and transnational perspectives and studies, LGBTQ and queer studies, where oftentimes religion is perceived as a, and I quote Wilcox, stultifying, oppressive institution of a heteronormative, sexist social order, end quote. The study also contributes to the growing body of affirmative resources on LGBTQ Muslims by really highlighting that LGBTQ Muslim women are living their lives, are existing, and are knowledge producers. And so practitioners in the human services arena, when they approach LGBTQ Muslim women, they don't necessarily have to come from a place that you can either be queer, LGBTQ, or Muslim. You can be both. And the other important finding is that resistance and agency were grounded in the Islamic principles that I had shared with you a few moments ago. And LGBTQ Muslim women did not abandon Islam or their sexuality, gender identity, and expression. In fact, they were able to reconcile and hold steadfast to their truth of being LGBTQ Muslim women. And by that, I would like to stop and thank you so much for your engagement. And I look forward to your questions and comments. And I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mariam. That was extremely informative. We thank you. I now welcome the attendees to ask questions. You can use the chat box. You can click on the Q&A button. You can ask away. So we have our first question. It's by an anonymous attendee. And the question is, what implications does your research have for mainstream Muslim organizations that provide mental health services to Canadian Muslim women?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a really great question. I think for some of the mainstream Muslim organizations, it would be really important to recognize that there are many different, experiences of Muslimness that may be cultural, that may be religious, that may be spiritual, and that there's many different ways of performing that Muslimness. And I think to be really open and be really intentional in how they want to support Muslims. So, for example, if they really want to encourage Muslims who are sexually and gender diverse and to come into their spaces and to honor their lived experiences, is to maybe have some affirmative resources, maybe have a staff member who identifies as queer and Muslim, and do what CCMW is doing, is inviting people like myself who do this work and who live this life to come and talk about experiences and to basically open up space and create space in a meaningful way. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Mariam, for that response. And if that's okay with you, I would like to go on to the next question.
Yeah.
The next question is by Sarah Shaw, and she asks, you mentioned your participants had reconciled their identities of queer, trans, and Muslim. Can you share a bit about the process of reconciling these identities?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sarah. That's a really great question. I think this whole process of reconciliation is a very interesting one. It's a very unique one to each person because everyone has to feel comfortable in, I believe, primarily, in their own skin. And when they feel comfortable, with who they are and the journey that they want to be on, I think from there, reaching out to family members and friends, whether they're within your community of origin or choice, to reach out and to share about who you are. And so I think for me, growing up as a queer Muslim, I was hearing a lot of how do I say, perspectives from my mom, from my sister, and, you know, from everybody who told me that, you know, what I was doing is sinful and it's wrong. And but deep down inside my heart, I knew that I was okay and that I was loved by the Creator. And so I never questioned that I, you know, cannot be queer and Muslim because this is the way the Creator made me. So I think reflecting on the fact that, you know, the Creator in their amazing awesomeness, you know, has intentionally created people and has been very intentional with creation. So I think you know, coming to terms with who you are first, and then being okay with that can be a start. And also, you know, finding like-minded people, because I know there's a lot of you know, narratives and experiences out there that are very much you know, experiences of pain and sorrow and grief, you know, of the violence that has been inflicted on queer Muslim people, you know, from the state, whether it's the family. So I feel like there needs to be some space for also healing, and healing can coincide with being on your journey. So I think accepting who you are and finding people who love you and support you can be really awesome. And finding like-minded people and doing your own research. Like some of the participants had mentioned, you know, going to the texts yourself and looking at, you know, based on your own experiences. And one thing that I want to share was one of the participants who I didn't mention here. She was a Black convert to Islam and in the States. And she told me that when she first converted to Islam, she was practicing this sort of Saudi version of Islam, and it didn't fit well with her as a Black woman growing up in America. And so I think we really need to look at, you know, how, like what we embody and who we are and where we're situated, and try to find our own relationship with Islam. Sorry, that was a very long-winded response. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Mariam, for that response. I'm going to go ahead with the next question by Carlos. The question reads, did you find any relationship between acceptance and sect belonging? For example, hypothetically, of course, Salafists were less accepting versus Shia or Sufis, or was sect not a factor?
You know, I wish I had time to do that. Thank you for that question, Carlos. That's a great question. I wish I had time to do that really cool analysis. Unfortunately, I didn't, and I hope to do some more of this work in the future, inshallah, yes. But in terms of, you know, with the 14 participants, I noticed that there was a lot of people being more open to some of the Sufi approaches to Islam. And you know, so irrespective of if you're Shia, Ismaili, and, you know, Sunni, you know, there's like conservative, I hope I don't get you know, in trouble for this, but there's conservative, you know, perspectives in every kind of sect, right? So I think there needs to be some kind of openness to accepting different types of Muslimness. But in terms of you know, Salafism or Wahhabism, there was a lot of critique that the participants did because of those perspectives, because these perspectives have really marginalized sexual and gender minorities and women, you know, across the globe. For example, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, you know, even in other places too. So there's a camp where of Muslims who, you know, and the participants, they were talking about that when they, for example, the converts, I had 1, to 3 converts, and when they first entered Islam, they fell into this really conservative Salafi tradition because that's what they thought Islam was. And I think oftentimes, you know, us living here in Canada, oftentimes, you know, people ask us like, you know, what Islam, you know, this is what Islam means, or does it equal terrorism? Like, does your religion tell you to do these bad things? But I think there is definitely an expansion of the different kinds of Islams. So I think, you know, with what's happening geopolitically, I think it would be important to maybe not paint people in a very specific tradition as being, you know, inherently homophobic, transphobic, because there's people who are, you know, very liberal within the Salafi tradition too, right? So I think I think it's great to have conversations with people and just to really explore. But that's something that I would like to do in the future study more particularly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. We have another question from Kanza, and it reads, I think it asks, what is your opinion about your study and if you think it should be a part of sex education in schools?
Thank you for that question. That's a very big question. I think maybe if, I mean, personally speaking, I would be like, yes. But I think, you know, people across, you know, varying diasporic communities, you know, the Syrian diasporic community, the Pakistani diasporic community, and all these other communities, I think they're having dialogues, you know, about what is acceptable and what is not. So sometimes, you know, even like just a few years ago, we were having this conversation about what's appropriate sex education, and people were really upset. And actually, there was a lot of pushback from the normative Muslim community about, you know, including LGBTQ related information in the curriculum. And so I think maybe I would honestly love for me to go and talk about this, these, you know, identities in the public, more public forum, you know, in the education board. But I think maybe we can start by little steps, by, you know, just educating our own families and having these kinds of conversations at home. And then, you know, hopefully there will be a ripple effect and more people can sort of come on board, because there's been a huge opposition for any kind of diversifying sex education from, you know, religious groups, not only Muslim, but Christian and Jewish groups as well. So I think maybe we can start from our own families.
Thank you very much, Mariam. We have a question in the chat box, and I'm just going to read it out loud verbatim, if that's okay.
Yes.
And it reads, thank you. Did anyone talk about dysphoria and how that can impact identity and the intersections of being Muslim? And by dysphoria, I not only refer to people who wish to appear more masculine, femme, or I'm not going to butcher that word, but
androgynous.
Thank you. I'm also referring to a non-binary form of dysphoria that doesn't have any masculine, feminine, or, so you said the word and I'm going to learn it. So can you say it again?
Androgynous.
Androgynous.
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you. I hope it doesn't come up again. Oh, it does. Okay, I'm also referring to a non-binary form of oh yeah, we read that. Labels, but simply is, because having dysphoria for certain body functions can also be connected to why some non-binary identify as asexual.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. I think I'm just thinking back to the interviews and all the data, all this amazing rich data that I collected. I think for the non-binary and the trans-identified participants, they did talk about some of this dysphoria, but it wasn't framed in those terms. It was framed as, you know, within their families of origin, within how gender was played out in their families, and how gender was taken up, or mention of gender or not mention of gender. So there was this one participant who identified as non-binary, and they told me that they didn't feel like they needed to come out to their parents or their family because their parents already knew how they walked in this world by the ways in which they would carry themselves, the way they would perform, wear clothing or not wear clothing, or do some of the, designated quote unquote like gender specific tasks in the house. But I think for a deep layer of analysis, I really didn't focus on that in the study. And inshallah, yes, perhaps in the future, I would love to do more of this work.
Thank you, Mariam. We have about 2 more questions left, unless anyone asks something now. But one question is, what was the reason you chose this thesis/topic?
That's a really great question. So I think for me, everything is political and the personal is political. That's my adage that comes from a Black feminist thought. And so for me growing up, I didn't see people who were really affirmative in being Muslim and queer. I mean, there were a few people, but they were so out of reach. And I was this puny little kid in Scarborough. So I just really, I was just thirsting. I was hungering for someone to, tell me that it was going to be okay, and that there's people like me who are queer and Muslim, and I can celebrate with them. But unfortunately, as I grew up, I started to find more like-minded people, and I think I really wanted to create affirmative knowledges, and really uplift the voices of lesbian, bisexual, queer, and trans Muslim women, because women are not often seen as knowledge holders and knowledge producers. So I've had very strong women, including my mom and my sister and my aunts in my life, and my grandmother too. So I had a really great, set of experiences with feminists in my own family, and so I really wanted to do something that would be empowering, to not really minimize some of the, traumas and harms that come with, and adversities that come with living a LGBTQ life and identifying as such. But I think I wanted to celebrate the resistance and the agency, because I'm very stubborn, and so when someone tells me I can't do something, I dig my heels in. And so I think for me, I was like, no, I'm going to do this work, and I know there's someone like me in this world. And so I really wanted that representation.
Thank you very much, Mariam. So we have a question that asks, are there any resources to educate or increase awareness of parents? Please do share. They're looking to get support from Muslim parents who discover that their children are gay or lesbian.
Wow, that is a really great question. Actually, I am currently, there's not that many resources out there. There's a toolkit. From what I remember, it's out of the US, I believe Minneapolis, from a group of, I forget the name of the group, but it's called Muslim Queer and Muslim Toolkit. I'll see if I can, let me make a note. And I can find it and I can put it in the chat.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, that really speaks to some of the things that you're talking about in your question. And so what I'm trying to do is, with my research, actually I have a research study right now, which is looking at how families of origin and choice and kin of queer Muslims respond to queerness, and how they demonstrate acceptance, and how they demonstrate love, and how they demonstrate discouragement or rejection. So I'm looking at a study. I'm doing a study with all across Canada, and I'm interviewing people who are family members as well as queer Muslims. And so And I'm doing this in conjunction with Salam Canada, which is the most fabulous organization in the entire universe. It's a great organization, nonprofit for queer Muslims and their allies. And so there were many people who were pro Salam Canada and said, "Hey, you know, my kid's gay. I don't know what the heck they're talking about. How do I deal with this kid? Or what do I do? Tell me. Like, I'm struggling with the language and how to approach. And I want to be supportive, but I'm scared for my child. You know, I don't want them to experience harm in society." And so I find that even with my own parents, I think my parents had initially been like very shocked. And I think that was coming from a place of love, and it was coming from a place of concern, because, you know, being racialized and being Muslim, your life is already very much systemically how do I say, impacted by the systems of injustice, right? And then so to add the queerness piece to it can be, you know, very scary for parents, right? And so I think what I'm trying to do with that research is called Queer Muslims and Their Families, and I can also put in the website address in the chat here, and I'm hoping with that research that there could be some amazing resources that really look at Muslim families as part of the therapeutic process, as not someone who is outside of, you know, supporting their child. And so and this is the first of its kind where actually I'm talking to Muslim families about their kids' sexual and gender diversity. So it's really cool. I'm really excited about it. And so I can stick that in the chat. Yeah.
Thank you. I think quite a few people would really benefit from those resources. So thank you for sharing that in the chat. We have a question that asks, in this study of 14 participants, you did say that all were racialized members except one. What ethnic backgrounds did most of them have? If it's okay to share, please do.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had 12 participants that identified as racialized, and 2 participants that identified as white, of European descent. And so the racialized participants, they were South Asian, so Pakistani, Indian, from Bangladesh, Guyanese, African, Nigerian, Iranian, trying to remember off the top of my head. Yeah, I think it was, and for the, and I had 3 converts, so 2 white converts and 1 Black Muslim convert. Sorry, what was more to that question? Sorry, can you, I don't think I forgot the rest of the question.
I think you answered it.
Okay.
The question was just what ethnic background where did most of them have? So I think you nailed it.
Okay.
So I'm throwing quite a few questions at you, Mariam. At any time that you want me to slow down, let me know. Is it okay to continue?
Yes.
Okay. So we have a question that reads, what role did colonialism play in the fear of same-sex relationships? By this, I mean the Western criminalization of same-sex relationships, as schooling does play a role.
Absolutely. That's a great question. Like, how much time do we have? Actually, you know, a lot of the laws that criminalize same-sex relationships, you know, in Pakistan, for example, there were colonial laws. In India, they were repealed recently. And so colonization had a very specific you know, understanding of gender, very specific understanding of femininity, which was very much Victorian, white Victorian femininity, and very sort of like a very toxic masculinist idea of masculinity. And so all of these kinds of, you know, understandings of gender, which were, of course, affirmed through religion within the the larger Christian churches. And so that has a huge role in how, you know, in many post-colonial societies and, you know, Muslim societies across the globe have a very sort of maybe Victorian way of thinking about sexuality and gender. So there's these groups of amazing individuals called human rights defenders that work with amazing NGOs across the globe who are trying to decolonize and bring and talk to within their communities of origin about how pre-colonial times, how sexuality and gender was understood. Even, one of my great friends who identifies as Khwaja Sira, there's a huge Khwaja Sira, community in Pakistan. And so these kinds of great activists and these social movements are really trying to challenge some of these norms that have really come through, culture and laws in post-colonial societies. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mariam. One person asked, they said, I work in a women's shelter and I'm wondering if there are ways that you would recommend to support residents who are Muslim and queer. And they went on to continue, especially in relation to intimate partner violence.
Okay. Muslim and queer intimate partner violence. Yes. I actually, it's not very, that's a great question. It doesn't really get talked about a lot, especially same-sex, intimate partner violence, as well as, being a queer Muslim in the shelter system. And so I think one of the great places to start would be with having conversations on the team, like at the team level, and even with the board members of the organization to talk about how things can become more inclusive in terms of policies and regulations and what that looks like in day-to-day practice. Because I think once the staff and sort of the organizational culture is somehow more inclusive, I think, excuse me, I think it will really impact the residents of the shelter. And that can really inform programming and policy changes. So I think starting with having, a robust discussion at team meetings would be a great place to start. I remember I used to work at Nellie's Shelter for Women in downtown Toronto, and we always had very robust conversations about trans women who were coming to live at the shelter, about intimate partner violence. And of course, there's a lot of great research that's out there that's being done. So if you get a chance and if you have connections to, universities and centers, I'm sure they would have some great ways for you to access some of the scholarly literature on this topic as well. It's growing for sure.
Thank you, Mariam. I'm going to ask another question and I'm just going to read it verbatim. Mariam, I know the questions of the thesis are different, but I would really like to know if you had asked the LGBTQ women group if they had some solid negative reason to choose who they are now. For example, some women have bad relationships and extreme negative experiences with men in their lives, and they dislike to be with them and choose this option and so on. Did any of them mention something, or was it just a simple choice?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's a very big conversation, which talks about the underlying assumptions is, where does sexuality, where does gender identity and expression originate? Is this something that is nurture, or is this something that is nature? And so I think, there's so many different camps, and for example, within queer studies, for example, there's this whole sense of like essentialized identity as something that is living inside of you, as of who you are. You're either gay or straight is very much challenged. Whereas in some other studies, these kinds of ideas are really important because you don't want to be like, I hate it when people tell me like, oh, it's a choice. I'm like, no, it's not. So I think I had these conversations with the participants about what makes them queer and what makes me queer, and I think and having these conversations, it is about a mix of both nature and nurture. And for me, it's about, creation. And there's examples of queer animals in nature, right? And so I always go back to that sort of, to that fact that, if it's in nature, then it's intentional and it's cool. So I think with the participants that I spoke to, it didn't come up in conversations about, for especially for the bisexual women, that they said that, I've had a very bad experience with my husband. He was abusive, and so I feel more safe and protected with women. And so I didn't have those conversations. And I think there's a lot of bisexual Muslims out there, and so I think I would love to have more conversations to find out, more about these conversations. But I think there's definitely the safety piece as well. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you. Okay. One person said they're curious, did you have any Hispanic or East Asians?
No, unfortunately, I did not. I regret that very much. That's a great question. I think, when I was doing this by myself and I didn't have funding or anything like that. So now I have this gig at Laurier, so I can apply for SHRC funding for some of these amazing research studies. And so I think that is something that I could definitely look into in the future.
Thank you. I'm going to read this. I believe it's a question, so I'm just going to read it verbatim and hopefully we can figure it out as we go along. And it reads, did I miss, and you had mentioned within the LGBTQ group, the female members face more mental health issues and challenges overall as compared to male intersectionality. You did mention that the LGBTQ group of the larger community is at much more ease and faces less pressure than the Muslim groups.
I think that's a great question. I think what I was mentioning is that that because of so many hegemonic norms and so many things pulling you in different directions. For example, like the lure of compulsory heterosexuality is so powerful, and oftentimes, queer Muslims will stay closeted because, it is if they were to come out and their parents are not there for them, it's very hard because you being so for example, me as a racialized person, my communities of belonging, they're not just provide me safety, but they also provide me with a sense of identity and belonging. And so some people have to be really careful if they come out, and then they're going to lose in many ways, sometimes permanently, sometimes not permanently, members of their community, members of their let's just say mosque group. I've lost people like that as well, but I've also gained so many amazing people who love me and support me. And so in terms of mental health, I didn't look at that aspect particularly. And the other research study, I'm doing another plug. The other research study that I'm doing is it's called, what is it called? I don't remember the title, but it looks at some of the experiences of queer Muslims who are accessing social services and support. So for example, when they've accessed mental health services, settlement services, addiction services. For me, I have mental health and addiction issues, and I'm in recovery. So all the research that I do is very much a part of my lived experience. And so I am doing that study right now to recruit participants to talk to them about their experiences of mental health. So it would be really cool to find out, if there are differences, if you identify as male, if you identify as gay or lesbian or whatever, if there's more incidences of experiences of mental health. in one particular group or not. So that is coming soon.
Thank you, Mariam. And we look forward to that. This looks like it is the last question. And it reads, I'm wondering, oh no, I spoke too soon. I'm wondering on a personal level, how you would recommend introducing a partner to a Muslim family.
That's a great question. I think, you deep down inside, your family. And so I think for me, what I did was, like I use my partners as friends, and even now my mom, she accepts my partner, but my mom doesn't call my partner by her name. Actually, my mom calls her my friend, not because my mom is homophobic or anything like that, but because that is the language that she uses, and just because she doesn't use the right language doesn't mean that she's homophobic. So I think you can find your own way, and you can explain. Sometimes you don't even have to explain. Sometimes you just have to dress a certain way and your parents will be like, okay, I get what you're trying to tell me with the gender performance, or sorry, I was just trying to make a joke. But I think, sharing with your parents and letting them come to terms with it, because it took me such a long time to come to terms with it. So I cannot accept, other people to just come around right away, because it's a big deal, right? Because my mom said, what would people say? And I'm sure like that's what some of you have heard as well, right? Like, what is my larger community going to say? What am I going to tell the mosque people? Or like Uncle G from down the street, like, he's going to want to know why you're not married, and things like that. So I think these things have to be negotiated. But I think, just being patient, which is very, very hard, and taking your time, and honestly having a conversation with the creator. It's been really helpful for me. So
Thank you. So we are supposed to wrap up for 9, and I just have a couple things to get through before we wrap up. So we have 2 more questions. I'm going to leave one. I believe you can see the Q&A, Mariam, so maybe if you have time to type a response to Uzma later on, if there's time. But the very last question reads, if I want to participate in your study, what do I do? Maybe we can answer that one for now, and we can go back to the remaining. I just have some things to get through, and we can see if we have room for the last question by Uzma.
okay, give me a second. Sorry, I'm just going to I don't remember the URL address off the top of my head, so I'm just gonna pull it up and then paste it into the chat. And okay, there's one. Let's get another one. Just bear with me, this one. Okay, and I'm just putting the other URL address in. So I mean, with these 2 research studies, I have a fantastic research team. So please feel free to go on these websites, these addresses, and look at the study page, look at what we're doing. It would be really great. And sorry, you were saying that there was a question from.
Yeah, I'm going to send you, actually, I'm going to send you a direct message with the question just in case you have time, but I did want to wrap up. So I'll send that to you specifically, or maybe just to the panelists, I guess, and maybe if you have time. But I do want to say thank you to Mariam for this excellent seminar, and thank you to the attendees. We hope that we all have gained something from this. Please note that a post-event survey will be emailed to each of you, and that we did want to say that the Canadian Council of Muslim Women works very hard to push forward empowerment, equality, and equity of all Muslim women in Canada, including sexually and gender diverse Muslim women. We're a very small team of dedicated and hardworking women, and together we've been able to do groundbreaking and nationwide work under the leadership of Nazhat and Nina. We have various projects going on, including the Legal Services Coordination Pilot Program, CCMW's Digital Anti-Racism Education project, the second version of it. We also had the Leela Falman Scholarship Fund. which awards scholarships to Canadian Muslim women who are enrolled in a full-time undergraduate or graduate degree or certificate program at a Canadian college or university. But we can only do all of this with your support. So we do want you to please consider donating to CCMW so we can continue to do this excellent and much needed work. I did want to end with a closing dua, and I'd like to read a verse from the Quran from Surah An-Nisa. And a fun fact, Harvard University recognizes this Quranic verse as one of the greatest expressions of justice in history. And it reads, O ye who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even as against yourselves or your parents or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor, for Allah can best protect both. I want to thank each of you. And again, thank you to Mariam for taking the time for this excellent seminar. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. I'm so appreciative. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
No problem. So I do see that's 8:58. So technically we do have 2 minutes. Do we want to try to answer the very last question?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to find it.
No, I can read it to you if it's okay.
Okay.
Okay. It does say, my last question is, science, as you mentioned, came late than the religion Islam. Science goes and agrees to what Quran and Islam says in every aspect, either it's medicine, nature, psychology, depression, disease, and so on. What is your opinion on what religion and the Holy Book says for the LGBTQ community? Prophet Nuh something was an example. So what would you say for science as its genetics, hormonal, or what? Sorry, but just a question where I would like to know your thoughts. I know we are all not experts. That was a little scattered, so I don't know if you got anything out of that, but just in case, I felt bad to leave one question unanswered.
Thank you for that question. I think that's a great question. I think these conversations are actually happening as we talk in many different communities. So there is a growing body of knowledge of research that is calling for the gay gene, being queer and Muslim as something that you're born with. So there is perspective on that. There's also another perspective that says, that we are, creatures of nurture, right? And the social world influences us. So there's just so many perspectives. And even when you talk to any Muslim about Islam, there's so many different versions of Islam, so many different perspectives of Muslimness, and what that means, because there's such a thing as women's Islam and there's such a thing as men's Islam, right? So there's so much amazing scholarship that's out there that if you could tap into, if you have access to some of those resources. And I mean, I am a believer. And so for me, Islam is one path to follow, but there's so many different paths that one can take to follow in the divine will and the divine sunnah. And so I think these kinds of conversations are very, very important. And I wish we had more time, but I hope that you're able to access some resources if you're connected with a university or some kind of center.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Thank you to all the attendees. Thank you and salam alaikum.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.